Hi, welcome to Christ Glory Word Ministries Set Apart Youth. We are delighted to welcome you today and hope you enjoy your time with us. Before we start, I want to remind you of the promise of God over your life. Deuteronomy 14:2 says that you, yes you, are set apart as holy to the Lord. He chose you from all the nations of the earth to be his own special treasure. We hope this resonates with you. Be blessed as you join us. Genesis 1 Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In this very first line of the Bible, we see God at work. We see the entire cosmos formed in a 7-day framework. We see human beings put into the garden to work it and to keep it. My name is Damola, and I'm a follower of Jesus that has wrestled with questions surrounding the meaning of work. Chances are, whatever life stage you are at, you've also wrestled with questions about the meaning of work. You might have asked, why should I work? What should I do? Where should I do it? You may have also asked God for his view on work. You may have wondered if there's a link between his calling on our lives and our work. I believe the Bible has a lot to teach us about work, and I'm going to go through just some of that today. So I'm going to go through it in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about God's design for work. And then I'm going to talk about the dignity which we have as human beings doing work. And then I'm going to talk about our mandates of work as a form of cultivation, and then work as a form of service. And so, we can look at the story of creation. We see in the Hebrew Bible that it is a unique story. We see it's free of conflict, but it's not free of work itself. When we look at a neighboring nation, Babylon, their story of creation depicts the deity Marduk defeating his enemy and forging the earth out of his remains, the result of some uneasy balance of powers in tension. When we look at what was believed by ancient Greece, we see it's not too dissimilar, not having to do any work. We see the earth just providing food in abundance as a punishment. When we consider the Bible, however, we see that work isn't some form of necessary evil. It's not some form of punishment. God himself delighting. We also see God's providence, and he waters it. 5, we see that we see Psalm 104 and 104 made, giving help to those who suffer and caring for the needs of every living thing. We also see God commissioning those he has made. Though creation was good, it was still largely undeveloped. It still had so much untapped potential. And so in all this, we see that while God works for us, we also work for him. You see, work was part of paradise. And when we look at our lives, we see it is a basic human need, along with food, along with rest, along with friendship, along with prayer. Indeed, without meaningful work, we sense a deep sense of inner loss and emptiness. Leisure and pleasure are great goods. But as humans, we can only take so much leisure and pleasure before it starts to disturb us. Through the story of creation and the cycle of the Sabbath, we have a divine ratio for work and rest, a ratio of 6:1. Indeed, rest plays in our lives, and it then allows us to re-immerse. The story of the Bible exposes the idea that work is the only meaningful human activity, and that rest is some kind of necessary evil. You won't have a meaningful life without work. But it's also true that work cannot be the meaning of life. Our modern culture focuses so much on efficiency, on value, on speed. But we see that God didn't need restoration. God didn't need to recharge his batteries. It's good. It's not just to recharge our batteries. It's not just for restoration. We can assume that rest is life-giving in itself. We can see this in practical examples around us. Let's consider food. It has its necessary means to give us nutrition, but God also made it so that we might delight in it, so that we can enjoy it. I know I miss going to restaurants and eating good food. We can also see it in clothing. It has its necessary means to protect us, but it's also been made so that we might look decent, so that we can feel comfortable. When we look around and we see plants, we see trees, we see fruits, we see them all fulfilling their necessary purpose, but all providing beauty and fragrance. And so taking joy in the fruit of our labor is part of our worship. Now, you might tell me, we're not in paradise anymore, we're living in a fallen world. And it's true that work can often be frustrating and exhausting. Unhealthy relationships with work lead us to have this idea that we hate work, leads us to overwork and to underwork. In work, there's no more potent reminder of the curse of sin on all things. But we'd do well to remember that work itself is not the curse. Chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. I'll read. Then God said, "See, over the birds in the sky, over all of the livestock and all the wild work as a curse." They believed that humans were to become like the gods by withdrawing themselves from active life, from emotional connection, and devoting themselves to contemplation, beastly work which required the body. In Greek social structures, we see this attitude still. Now, slavery is looked down upon, quite rightly, in our modern society, but those same attitudes are still alive today. The attitude that sees lower status work as an assault on our dignity. Indeed, it's true that many will choose to be unemployed than do work that they believe is beneath them. We see this play out in our society. We see white-collar work, we see blue-collar work, we see many service sector jobs looked down upon in society. The Bible gives us a different view, however. We see that humans are the only ones who are given an office, an explicit job description, to subdue and to rule. So while the ancient Greeks saw ordinary work as relegating humans to the level of animals, the Bible instead elevates and distinguishes humans to a place of dignity, because work is also something that God does. The work of creation itself is manual labor. God shapes us from the dust. He puts a spirit in a physical body. He plants a garden. He waters it. The author Philip Jensen says this. He says, if God came into the world, what would he look like? To the Greeks, he would look like a philosopher king. To the Romans, he would look like a noble statesman. In other words, a politician. But to the God of the Hebrews, he came as a carpenter. In Genesis, we see that God is a gardener. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus coming as a carpenter. So simple physical labour is God's work no less than the formation of deep theological truth. We see that our work with the physical material world matters. The practical implications of this are huge, because it means no longer do we have a basis for condescension and for superiority, but it also means economic trouble. As followers of Jesus, we should therefore be able to identify with conviction and with satisfaction how our work participates with God in his creativity and cultivation. And that leads us on to the third section, seeing our work as cultivation. So let's go back to Genesis 1, back to the job description. To fill the earth and subdue it. We'll start with the first half, to fill the earth. When regarding the rest of creation, we see God says, let them. He says of the plants, let them multiply. Of the birds in the sky, let them increase in number. But to the humans, procreation isn't just a natural process. When humans increase in number, we create human society. We create towns, we create cities, we create civilization. God could have created many humans in many different settlements, but he didn't. Instead, he made it our job to develop them. And so we can move on to the second half of the job description, subdue. On the face of it, it's quite a harsh word. However, when we look in its original translation, we see that it's not a mandate to treat the world as if it is ours, not a mandate to exploit it and discard it at our own will. No, we see that the original translation of the word subdue is to assert one's will. And we see God himself doing this. Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 tells us that the material world was formless and empty. God addresses these two states progressively. In the first 3 days, he creates the heavens, the sky, the earth, the waters. He separates them all out from each other. And then on the next 3 days, he fills his creation with inhabitants. You see, active creation and assertion of our will is our calling. To rearrange the raw material of creation in a way that helps the world and people thrive and flourish. Tim Keller writes this. He says, this pattern is found in all kinds of work. Farming takes the physical material of soil and seed and produces food. Music takes the physics of sound and rearranges it into something beautiful and thrilling that brings meaning to life. When we take fabric and make a piece of clothing, when we push a broom and clean up a room, when we use technology to harness the forces of electricity, when we take an unformed, naive human mind and teach it a subject, when we teach a couple how to resolve their relational disputes, when we take the simple materials and turn them into poignant work of art, we are continuing God's work of forming, filling, and subduing. Indeed, our word culture comes from this very idea of cultivation. And so we'll move on to considering now work as service. The story of Genesis allows us to understand the design, the dignity and pattern of work. However, the New Testament now calls us to see how God calls us to serve the world with our work. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, We see 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we see Paul counseling the people of Corinth, telling them that it's not necessary for Christians to change their marriage. He says, rather, let each person lead the life assigned for Christ. He also equips them to build out human community. Neither is more important than this. Calling is a contribution to the good of all, not merely to one's own advancement, self-fulfillment, and power. Indeed, it's only a calling if another party calls you to do it for their sake, not your own. Fulfill ourselves to just accrue power. Instead, we are to see it as a form of service to our neighbours. Now, there's two questions which will allow us to see how this has an implication in our lives. The first question would be one that we might ask. We're then led instead to ask how, with my existing abilities and opportunities, can I be of greatest service to other people, knowing what I do of God's will and of human need. Now, it's counterintuitive, but the second question is the one which is going to lead us to actually having a more sustainable motivation for discipline and excellence. See, if the focus of our work is to serve and exalt ourselves, it ultimately becomes less about the work and more about ourselves. And so then our aggressiveness will turn to abuse. Our drive would turn to burnout. Our self-sufficiency would become self-loathing. We have a better reason to deploy our talent, our ambition, our entrepreneurial. Children. He could have given us children directly, but instead he joins man through ploughing a field, through digging a ditch, through voting. We see ways of doing his work in the world through which he distributes his gifts to us and to others. And when we consider salvation, there's always going to be some fundamental difference between those who did church ministry and those who didn't. Will be seen as superior to the gospel of salvation. In other words, the good news of Jesus Christ as us. However, many modern people do the same from their career success. Jobs that we consider to be higher paying jobs. Effect from the pressure of having to prove ourselves and secure our identity through our work. But it also frees us from having an envy to more exalted work. Work as a way to love our neighbour. We should see the world ablaze with the glory. Work is a form of love. Now, what's the first way to be? If the call of the Christian is to participate in God's ongoing creative process, surely the desire to succeed and produce excellent work, but they won't be driven to overwork, nor will they be despondent with poor results. No matter what the job itself, this principle becomes one of the main ways that we find satisfaction in our work. And so we see through the story of the Bible that our daily work is an act of worship. We see God's original design for work. We see how he exalts us as human beings, and how work exalts him. The entire story of the Bible is indeed a story of God's work to reconcile us to himself. He wants us to cultivate the earth. He wants us to serve one another, because it's something that he has called us to do and something that he has equipped us to do. Something filled with honor. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. We can't wait to see you again. Until then, please follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.